So imagine for just a second waking up every single day to military checkpoints, literally right outside your front door. Imagine facing strict restrictions on where you can go and just this constant heavy cloud of uncertainty hanging over your future and your family's future. It's got to be one of the most difficult, stressful situations a community could ever experience. But when I was diving into this source material for this explainer, something absolutely crucial stood out to me, something that honestly often gets lost in the noise of conflict. Even under these extreme chaotic conditions, civilians do not lose their basic human rights. And that brings us right to the foundational premise of international humanitarian law. Get this, occupation should be temporary and civilians must be protected, not punished. That right there is the anchor for everything we're going to explore today. It's a principle deeply rooted in historical frameworks, like the Hague Regulations and the Geneva Conventions. And those were drafted for a very specific reason, to prevent the horrors of past global conflicts from ever repeating. It is such a simple, powerful ideal, right? But actually applying it in the modern world, wow, it is incredibly complex. Okay, so let's set the stage by defining our terms. What exactly does occupation mean in a legal sense? Well, under international humanitarian law, an occupying power might exercise control over a territory, but, and this is the absolutely key part here, it doesn't gain unlimited authority over the people living there. No way. That power is highly conditional. It's strictly bound by rules designed to protect human life. So sovereignty isn't actually transferred. The occupier essentially becomes a temporary administrator with some very, very specific legal constraints. Welcome to today's explainer, where we're unpacking the rights of civilians living under occupation. We're going to look strictly at what international law actually says, who's responsible for protecting these rights, and why these legal frameworks matter so deeply to the human impact of conflict. I'm really excited to dig into this with you. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll cover the rules of occupation, then fundamental civilian protections, and protecting society and futures. After that, we'll look at the reality on the ground, and finally, pathways to protection. Let's jump right in. Section 1, the rules of occupation. Let's establish the absolute most basic human right under international law. So the most fundamental rule of all is the right to life. Civilians must never, ever be intentionally targeted. The law strictly prohibits violence, torture, collective punishment, extrajudicial killings, and enforced disappearances. Period. This is the absolute baseline. But here's where the application gets incredibly challenging. In modern urban warfare, distinguishing between a combatant and a civilian is notoriously difficult. It's like a giant, high-stakes puzzle. Yet even right in the middle of dense, active military operations, an occupying force has an unwavering legal obligation to make that distinction. The civilian population just cannot be punished for the actions of a few, and their personal safety has to be prioritized above everything else. Section 2, fundamental civilian protections. Moving beyond just physical safety, how exactly does international law guarantee the daily survival of a population? What's really fascinating here is that the occupying authority actually assumes some profound responsibilities towards the civilians. They're literally required to help ensure access to the bare essentials. We're talking food, clean drinking water, hospitals, medicine, and emergency healthcare. Just think about that for a second. Think about the sheer logistical nightmare of trying to pull that off during an active conflict. If the local resources simply aren't enough to meet these needs, international law mandates that humanitarian assistance from groups like the International Committee of the Red Cross or UN agencies has to be allowed in to reach those civilians. The occupier actually has a legal duty to facilitate this emergency relief. And this brings us to a super delicate legal balancing act. On one side, you have security restrictions. International law totally acknowledges that an occupying power might need to restrict movement for valid security reasons. However, these restrictions must be necessary, proportionate, and non-discriminatory. Now, proportionate legally means the security measure can't cause civilian harm that outweighs the direct military advantage. On the flip side of that balance, you have basic civilian needs. People still need to physically get to schools, to their jobs, to hospitals, and to their families, right? When security restrictions become excessive and actually cut off these basic needs, they create severe humanitarian problems, which the law explicitly tries to prevent. Section 3, protecting society and futures. Now let's look at how the law attempts to preserve the very fabric of a community and protect its most vulnerable members. The law deeply acknowledges that conflict disproportionately impacts certain groups. Kids, for instance, are granted special status. They absolutely must have access to family care and health care, And crucially, they have to be completely protected from unlawful recruitment into armed conflict. For women, the law explicitly mandates protection against sexual violence, harassment, and exploitation. It also requires additional medical support and care for pregnant women and mothers. And it turns out, safeguarding maternal care and youth protection isn't just about immediate health. It's actually legally recognized as absolutely essential for the future stability of the entire region. Zooming out from the individual for a moment, international law insists that an occupation should never erase a community's identity. And there's a really profound psychological component to this. People must be allowed to practice their religion, keep their cultural traditions alive, and protect their cultural sites. Actually, preserving schools and cultural heritage is treated with almost the exact same legal gravity as physical safety. Why? Because erasing identity is recognized as a truly devastating form of destruction. On top of that, private property basically has to be respected, and the law strictly prohibits the forced transfer or deportation of protected civilians, except in very, very limited temporary instances for imperative safety. Okay, so we've built a very clear picture of what international humanitarian law demands. The rules are structured, they're logical, and they're deeply humane. But here is the massive question we really have to confront right now. What happens when these perfectly written laws meet the chaotic, messy reality on the ground? Section 4. The reality on the ground. This is where we have to take an objective look at the breakdown of this legal framework. Unfortunately, there's often a really stark contrast between paper and reality in conflict zones all over the world. On paper, we have these incredibly strong legal rights and guaranteed humanitarian access. But in practice, enforcing these rights is just incredibly difficult. We see ongoing fighting and severely damaged infrastructure that can make delivering aid nearly impossible. But perhaps the biggest hurdle of all is the severe lack of accountability. I mean, who actually enforces these international laws when violations happen? Usually, it relies on international pressure or really complex tribunals, which means immediate enforcement on the ground is incredibly rare. And that makes the physical protection of civilians far more elusive than the original architects of these laws ever intended. Section 5. Pathways to protection. So how does the international community actually bridge that massive gap between paper and reality? Improving this situation requires a massive, coordinated effort from multiple actors. The required actions are crystal clear. All parties literally must respect international humanitarian law, and there has to be guaranteed safe access for humanitarian organizations right there on the ground. We also desperately need strong, independent monitoring and documentation of what's actually happening. When those actions are taken, it really paves the way for meaningful accountability. It leads to negotiations that actually reduce harm to civilians, and ultimately, it allows for genuine investment in reconstruction, in healthcare, and in education. Look, no solution here is simple, not by a long shot, but these are the absolutely necessary steps to reduce civilian suffering. Ultimately, diving into all this source material led me to a pretty profound realization. Occupation is without a doubt one of the most challenging, complex situations any civilian population can face. But the entire purpose of international law in these scenarios is to balance those harsh military realities with the uncompromising protection of human dignity. And that's the big takeaway here. Regardless of politics, regardless of nationality, and regardless of religion, civilians are legally entitled to protection, to dignity, and to basic human rights. Understanding this legal framework really helps us cut through all the noise and truly appreciate the human impact of conflict. Now, I want to leave you with a question, directly inspired by our source material, to genuinely think about. Based on everything we've looked at today, which civilian right do you think is the most difficult to protect during an occupation, and why? Take a moment to really reflect on that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.